They called it a peaceful death. That is what the doctor said as he stood over Pierre Dubois' body, wiping his hands while the house whispered and wept. The heart, he told them. Too much food, too much wine, too much heat. It simply gave out. But I knew better. I knew the truth, because I had poured it into his morning coffee with my own hands. The day had begun like many others in that grand house on Royal Street. The August air in New Orleans was thick and wet, clinging to my skin as I moved through the kitchen. I set the pot over the fire, stirred chicory into the boiling water, and watched the dark swirl of the coffee. My hands worked by habit while my thoughts circled the small glass vial in the pocket of my apron. I had touched it 3 times already that morning, checking that it was still there. The liquid inside was clear, thin, without scent or taste. The danger isn't in the plant, Marie told me when she gave it to me. The danger is in what you decide to do with it, child. When the coffee was ready, I took down his favorite porcelain cup, the one with tiny blue flowers around the rim. I filled it halfway, then slipped my fingers into my pocket. One careful tip of the vial, then a second, then a third. 3 drops slid into the dark surface and vanished. The house did not tremble. No voice from heaven called my name. Only the crackle of the fire and a wagon rattling past outside. I topped off the cup, added a little hot milk, and set it on the silver tray. To anyone else, it was simply breakfast. To me, it was a door. I carried the tray up the back stairs, my bare feet silent on the runner. When Pierre first brought me here, the high ceilings and polished railings had made me feel like a piece of furniture set in the wrong place. Now, as I climbed, something hard and steady formed inside my chest. I drew one slow breath and pushed the door open. He sat propped against the pillows, silk sheets around his waist, belly heavy under his nightshirt. His eyes moved over me like a buyer checking an animal at market. "About time," he snapped. "The coffee should have been here sooner." "It is hot, monsieur," I said, eyes lowered, voice soft. The obedient housekeeper, the grateful slave, the willing mistress, all of it costume. I set the tray across his lap and stepped back. He picked up the cup and drank without even smelling it. Pierre never savored anything. He simply consumed food, drink, land, people. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. My hands rested calmly at my waist. "Too sweet," he muttered, but he drank again. I left him, as I always did, to start the day's work. Downstairs, the house woke in its usual order. The maids opened shutters, the cook chopped vegetables, vendors called in many tongues. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary summer morning in New Orleans. Around midday, I was in the hallway directing the dusting when I heard a sound that did not belong. It was shorter, strangled, cut off halfway. The houseboy beside me stared at me with wide eyes. We ran. We pushed his door open and rushed inside. Pierre lay twisted on the bed, one hand clawing at his chest, the other gripping the sheet. His eyes bulged. His mouth opened and closed, but only a harsh rasp came out. Color drained from his face as we watched, the pink of drink and rage fading into dull gray. My scream was not. I let it rip from my throat, high and sharp. "Help! Fetch the doctor! Something is wrong with Monsieur Dubois!" I rushed to the bed, grabbing his shoulder, shaking him like a woman desperate to save the man who owned her. Inside, there was only a cold, steady quiet. I watched his legs kick, then slow, then stop, and I thought, this is what power feels like. Not the whip by his bed, not the papers in his desk. Power is watching a man who believes he controls everything discover that he cannot command one more beat from his own heart. By the time the doctor arrived, the struggle was over. Pierre lay still, head tilted to one side, mouth slack. The silk sheets that had once felt like a cage were now twisted cloth around a dead man's legs. The doctor pressed his ear to Pierre's chest, then his fingers to his neck. "A bad heart," he said at last. "Too much excess." The heat finished what his habits began. He pulled the sheet over Pierre's face. I stood at the foot of the bed, hands folded, eyes wet with tears I had called up on purpose. The rest of the day blurred past. Neighbors filled the parlor, speaking softly of his success, his importance, his kindness to his household. Later, when the visitors had gone and the house was quiet, I found the porcelain cup on the kitchen floor where it had fallen. The tiny blue flowers were shattered across the tiles. I knelt, gathered the pieces, and felt the sharp edges cut my skin. I was 22 years old, a slave who had killed her master, and the world was already calling it fate. It should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like breathing real air for the first time. I did not yet know about the will that would free me and leave me $5,000, or about the other men who would follow him into the grave, or the people whose freedom would be bought with their money. All of that lay ahead, but as I rose from the floor, the broken porcelain in my palm, I knew one thing with perfect clarity. This was not an accident. It was a beginning. My name is Delilah. One day they will call me the Black Widow of New Orleans. They will say I buried 7 husbands and took 7 fortunes, and argue over whether I was a monster or a woman who learned to turn a monstrous world against itself. Before you decide, remember this. It started with a single cup of coffee in a house where I was owned, on a morning when I understood that the most dangerous creature in New Orleans was not a man with power. It was a woman with a reason to kill. I was born in the summer of 1833, in the heavy air of a Louisiana sugar plantation that smelled of molasses and misery. The women said the heat that year was cursed, that the sun itself seemed to press down with the weight of punishment. My mother gave birth to me in the back room of the big house, where the air was thick with candle smoke and the cries of labor. She was a house slave, known for her calm hands and soft voice. The man who owned her was also the man who fathered me, though he never called me daughter. He called me the girl with the gold hair. From the first day of my life, I existed in a space between worlds. My skin was the color of café au lait, my eyes pale green like bottle glass, my hair catching the light in soft waves that glowed like threads of sunlight. Too light to belong fully to the world of the enslaved, too dark to be welcomed into the world of the free. That was the cruel magic of Louisiana, a place where bloodlines were tallied like coins and every shade between black and white carried its own price. They called me a quadroon, 1/4 African blood, 3/4 European. The term rolled off the tongues of white men like poetry, but it was nothing more than a measurement of ownership. It meant that I could be bought for more money than a darker girl, sold for reasons that had little to do with work and everything to do with pleasure. It meant that I would live close enough to freedom to taste it, but never close enough to grasp it. That cruel fraction of whiteness made me valuable, but it also made me dangerous. My mother tried to protect me from understanding that truth too early. She brushed my hair gently each morning and told me stories from the days before her spirit was broken. She would hum Creole lullabies that carried the rhythm of the river, songs about freedom, though she never used that word aloud. Freedom was a forbidden dream, something you whispered to God when no one could hear. She called me her blessing and her burden, because my light skin made the mistress hate her even more. The mistress, Madame Dubois, would come into the quarters with a face powdered as white as death, her perfume thick and sweet like decay. She'd look at me with a strange hunger, half envy, half disgust, and then turn to my mother with narrowed eyes. "You think you've made something fine," she'd say, "but all you've made is trouble." The mistress saw in me a reflection of her husband's sin, and in that reflection she saw her own humiliation. My mother would bow her head and keep her voice low, but I could feel the trembling in her hands. I was 5 years old when I learned what it meant to be watched. The master's gaze followed me wherever I went, a lazy, possessive stare that stripped away the small dignity my mother tried to preserve. He'd pat my head as though I were a pet, then trace my curls with a finger that made my mother's face turn to stone. I did not yet understand the meaning of his touch, but I understood fear. It filled the air around my mother like the scent of iron. By the time I was 10, I had been brought into the big house as a helper, to learn manners. The mistress said it would make me useful. I polished silver, fetched water, and carried messages. I watched the guests who came for dinners, planters, merchants, politicians. I learned how they moved, how they laughed, how they lied. I learned that white men could say the cruelest things in the softest tones. They called my mother girl even though she was older than most of their wives. They called me pretty child, and when they thought I couldn't hear, they whispered other words too, words like exotic, tempting, and worth a fortune. It was not until my 15th year that I realized I was being prepared, not educated. The older women whispered about the plaquage system arrangements where men of wealth would keep women of color as companions outside the law of marriage. It was a secret society that existed in the shadow of respectability. The girls chosen for it were paraded at the quadroon balls, where mothers bartered their daughters' beauty like merchants haggling over silk. These arrangements promised comfort, jewelry, even property, but they were chains made of gold. I told my mother once that I would never let a man buy me. She looked at me with a sadness that went deeper than any wound. "Child," she said softly, "you were bought the moment you were born. The plantation changed hands after the master died. Debt ate away at the estate like termites in old wood. I was 17 when the new overseer arrived, a thin, cruel man with a smile that never reached his eyes. He didn't know me, and he didn't care to. To him, I was a line item in an inventory. One quadroon girl, age 17, house-trained, unblemished, high market value. I still remember the day I was sold. It was late afternoon, the air heavy with rain. My mother clung to me until they pulled her away. Her nails scratched my arm as she screamed, "Remember who you are!" The sound of her voice followed me long after the wagon turned down the road to New Orleans. The slave market on Chartres Street was unlike anything I had ever seen. The noise was unbearable, men shouting bids, women sobbing, chains clinking against wood. The smell of sweat, salt, and despair filled my throat. I stood on a raised platform while strangers examined me as though I were fruit. One man prodded my arm, another tilted my chin to inspect my face. I forced my body to stay still, my eyes to remain calm. The auctioneer's voice boomed. A rare beauty, a true quadroon, educated, well-spoken, trained for household service. The bidding began, and then I saw him, Pierre Dubois, wealthy merchant, importer of sugar, cotton, and human lives. He wore a white suit despite the heat, a gold watch chain glinting against his vest. His gaze slid over me like oil. $1,500, he said casually, as though ordering a glass of wine. The room went quiet. It was an enormous sum, even for a house slave. The auctioneer grinned, struck the hammer, and said, "Sold." Pierre walked up to me, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You'll do nicely," he said in French, his voice smooth and poisonous. "We'll have you properly settled." That night, I was taken to his mansion on Royal Street, a house of marble and mirrors, with iron balconies and chandeliers that sparkled like ice. They dressed me in silk and called me mademoiselle, as if the word could erase the truth. But I saw the other women's eyes. They knew what I was now, not a servant, not a wife. Something in between, something worse. A possession polished until it gleamed. Pierre told me I was lucky. "Many girls would give anything for a life like this," he said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "All I ask is that you please me, and you will never want for anything." I smiled the way my mother had taught me, sweetly, silently, carefully. Inside, I felt the first flicker of what would one day become a flame. It was not love. It was not even hatred. It was a slow, patient knowing that my body might belong to him for now, but one day my fate would belong to me. When I first arrived at Pierre Dubois' mansion on Royal Street, I thought I had stepped into another world. The air inside was thick with perfume and pride. Chandeliers glittered above marble floors, polished until they shone like mirrors, and every wall seemed to whisper of money. It was not beauty that lived there, it was vanity dressed in silk. Pierre was 53, though he pretended to be younger. His hair was already thinning, and his belly strained against his fine linen shirts. He was the kind of man who measured his worth by how many people bowed when he entered a room. And now I was expected to bow deepest, and of all. They gave me a suite of rooms on the second floor, fit for a lady, he said, smiling as though the words were kindness. The bed was four-posted mahogany, the sheets smooth as water, but to me it was a gilded cage. Every inch of that house gleamed with luxury, but nowhere inside it could I breathe without permission. Pierre did not beat me at first. He didn't have to. His power came from the quiet certainty that my body and my will were his property. He liked to remind me that I cost him more than most men spent on land. "You're an investment," he told me once, running a jeweled hand along my arm. "And I expect returns on my investments." I learned quickly that resistance was dangerous and silence was survival. During the day, I ran the household, overseeing the cooks, arranging flowers, setting tables for guests who came to trade sugar and slaves in the same breath. In the evenings, I played hostess, standing behind Pierre's chair while he boasted about his ships, his business, his delicate companion. The men would glance at me with the same expression they gave to fine wine, appreciation mixed with appetite. Their wives pretended not to see. At night, when the laughter faded and the candles burned low, Pierre would summon me. His voice would come through the door like the crack of a whip. "Delilah." It was not a name then, it was a command. I would go to his room and lie beside him, my body still, my mind far away. He would whisper that I was lucky to be chosen, lucky to live in silk and not sweat, lucky to belong to him. Each word felt like a chain tightening around my throat. The first time he struck me, it was because I spoke without being asked. A small thing. He was reading the ledger aloud and miscounted one of the entries. I corrected him. The back of his hand was swift and sure. My lips split. The taste of copper filled my mouth. He didn't even apologize. He laughed and said, "A quick tongue, but you'll learn." That night I understood that pain was not the worst part of slavery. The worst part was the way it tried to convince you that pain was normal. I endured for 2 years, 2 years of dinners and bruises, of forced smiles and whispered obedience. I watched myself fade from the inside out. I told myself that endurance was strength, that patience was safety, but the truth is, I was waiting. I didn't know for what, but I knew it would come. The turning point arrived on a spring evening in 1835. Pierre hosted a guest from Charleston, another merchant who trafficked in sugar and flesh. They drank brandy in the parlor while I poured for them, their conversation drifting through the smoke. "She's well trained," Pierre said, motioning to me as though describing a horse. "Obedient, clean, good with accounts. I paid 1,500 for her, but I'd let her go for 2,000 if the offer's serious." The man chuckled, eyes sliding over me. "Has she borne? Children?" "Not yet," Pierre said, "but she's young. She will." They spoke about my fertility as though it were crop yield. Something in me shifted then, not rage, but clarity. I saw the truth of my future. There would be no freedom, no reprieve, no kindness. Only men like Pierre, taking turns owning me until I was used up and discarded. I smiled through the conversation, my hands steady as I poured their drinks. Inside, something was being born. The next morning, when Pierre left for his warehouse, I walked to the French market under the pretense of buying spices. That was where I saw her again, Marie Laveau. She stood behind her stall, surrounded by herbs, candles, and jars filled with mysterious liquids. Her presence drew people like a tide. She looked at me once, and it felt as though she could see the blood beneath my skin. "You've come to the crossroads," she said. "I need help," I told her. "I need to be free." Marie smiled, slow and knowing. "Freedom has a price, child. Are you ready to pay it?" "Yes." She studied me a moment longer, then nodded. "Then listen. Over the next weeks I returned whenever I could, pretending to run errands for the house. Marie taught me things no priest would dare speak aloud: how to grind certain flours into powder, how to mix them with milk or wine, how to hide my thoughts behind a calm face. "Men like him," she said, "believe they're gods. But power makes gods careless. Carelessness kills." The plant she gave me was beautiful oleander, pink and fragrant, blooming in the gardens of the rich. "Its poison," she said, "could make a man's death look like his own indulgence. Too much wine, too much anger, too much life," she whispered. "That's what they'll say." For weeks I studied Pierre's habits, how he liked his coffee, when he took his drink, which cup he used. I memorized his routines with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a single, irreversible act. Fear came to me in the dark sometimes, whispering that I was damning my soul. But then I would remember his laughter as he described selling me, and the fear dissolved like sugar in hot water. The night I chose was ordinary. He had been drinking heavily after losing money in a shipment delay. His temper flared, and he left a bruise on my shoulder that would last for days. When he finally collapsed into sleep, I sat beside the bed and watched him snore, his mouth slack and open. "You will not wake as master," I whispered. "You will wake as memory." At dawn, I went to the kitchen. I prepared his coffee, chicory, cream, and the secret addition Marie had taught me. I carried it upstairs, hands steady, heart calm. He was half awake when I entered. "Finally," he grumbled, taking the cup. "You move too slow." He drank deeply, then waved me away. I turned and walked out before the poison took hold. By noon, he was dead. The doctors said it was his heart. The neighbors said it was the heat. The slaves said nothing at all. But I knew. I stood in the parlor when they read the will, expecting to be sold again like furniture. Instead, the lawyer's voice trembled as he read the words Pierre had written months before his death. "To my housekeeper, Delilah, who has served me faithfully and brought comfort to my declining years, I leave the sum of $5,000 and grant her complete freedom from bondage." I almost laughed. Even in death, Pierre believed he controlled me. But the truth was, for the first time, no man did. That night, I walked through the silent halls of the mansion. I touched the polished railings, the velvet drapes, the portraits of men who thought they owned the world. Every object gleamed with wealth stolen from the suffering of others. And I thought, if one man's death could set me free, what could 7 do? The first cage was broken, the first kill was done, and for the first time in my life, I slept without fear. Freedom felt strange on my skin. When the lawyer handed me Pierre's will, I expected another trick, another man's promise written in ink that could vanish when convenience demanded. But the words were real. Complete freedom from bondage, he'd said, like it was a reward for loyalty rather than an accident of his own death. The money, $5,000, was enough to buy a life many could only imagine. Yet when I walked out of that mansion for the first time as a free woman, I didn't feel free. I felt unanchored, like a boat cut loose from the dock without knowing which way the river ran. The city greeted me with sound carriages clattering down cobblestone streets, vendors calling out in French and Creole, music drifting from the taverns near the harbor. New Orleans in the 1,830 seconds was a place of contradictions. White men ruled, free people of color built quiet empires, and the enslaved worked in the shadows of both. Beauty and rot lived side by side, sharing the same humid air. I walked through it like a ghost reborn. For the first few weeks, I rented a small room in the Faubourg Marigny district, near the edge of the French Quarter where the air smelled of salt and sugar. I dressed modestly, avoided gossip, and tried to decide what to do with my life. The papers called me Madame Dubois, though the law never recognized my marriage. I had money, yes, but not a name that protected it. A free woman of color could own property but not respect. Without a husband, I was a curiosity. With one, I could be prey. Either way, I was still a woman alone in a city that fed on both power and rumor. At night, I would sit by the window with a candle burning low and replay the sound of Pierre's last breath. It didn't haunt me, it instructed me. The silence that followed his death was not guilt, it was clarity. For the first time, I had acted upon my own will. For the first time, I had rewritten the terms of my life. And once you've tasted that kind of control, it's impossible to forget the flavor. Still, I knew I had been lucky. Oleander was a blunt instrument, a hammer disguised as a flower. I had followed Marie Laveau's recipe to the letter, but instinct had guided me more than skill. If I wanted to survive, and if I wanted to do what I was beginning to imagine, I needed to learn properly. I needed to understand the art, not just the act. So I went back to her. Marie's house on Street Ann Street was smaller than I remembered, but it breathed with power. Candles flickered in every corner, casting long shadows that moved like living things. The air smelled of sage and smoke. Saints stared down from Catholic icons, their eyes painted with pity, while African spirits danced behind them in the shapes of carved wood and iron charms. The two worlds didn't clash here. They mingled like blood and wine. She greeted me before I spoke. "You came back sooner than I expected." "I'm free now," I said. She smiled, showing teeth too white to belong to someone ordinary. "Freedom," she murmured. "That word is heavier than people think. It has a cost, and it always comes due." "I can pay it," I said. "I already have." Marie studied me for a long time, her gaze sharp and steady. "You killed him, then?" "I did. Do you feel clean?" I thought of Pierre's face, grey and twisted. "I feel awake." "Good," she said softly, "because knowledge without awakening is useless. Sit." She poured me a cup of bitter tea and began to talk, not in whispers or riddles, but with the authority of someone who understood the anatomy of fear. "What you did with Oleander was luck and timing, but there are cleaner ways, quieter ways. Poison is not about death, it's about patience. It's about giving a man enough rope to hang himself and making him thank you for the knot." Over the following weeks, I became her student. My lessons were not written in books, but in the rhythm of the city itself. Marie taught me how to move through New Orleans unseen, which vendors to trust, which herbs the apothecaries sold under false names, which midwives carried more secrets than medicine. She taught me to watch people, to measure their weaknesses, to predict the small habits that could be turned into doors of opportunity. She spoke of power as something fluid. "Men think it's about force," she said one evening, as we mixed powders under the flicker of a candle. "They build laws and chains because they fear the power they cannot see. But a woman's power is invisible. It's in her silence, in the way she listens, in the way she waits." I listened, I waited, and I learned. The science of it fascinated me. There were poisons that mimicked fever, others that caused paralysis, others that could drive a man mad without ever leaving a mark. Marie's knowledge of botany and human anatomy would have shamed most doctors. "Doctors are blind," she said. "They see symptoms, not causes. That's why we can hide in plain sight." I began to see the pattern. The stronger the poison, the simpler the explanation. No one questioned death in a city built on decay. Yellow fever, heat stroke, bad meat, these were New Orleans' everyday killers. If a man of wealth died suddenly, people shook their heads and said, "Ah, the air here is treacherous." No one looked for a woman's hand in it. But Marie also taught me the rules of survival. "Never use the same method twice," she warned. "Never take more than you need. And never, ever boast. Power that announces itself invites destruction." Sometimes when she spoke, I wondered if she saw what I was becoming. Once she touched my wrist and said, "You're not doing this for vengeance alone." "I'm doing it because I can," I said. She laughed, a low, rich sound that carried both amusement and warning. "Be careful, child. Power feels like freedom until it starts to own you." Still, I couldn't stop. Each lesson made me hungrier. I learned to disguise powders in wine, to slip tinctures into ink, to poison without bitterness or scent. I practiced steadying my breath, my face, my voice. I learned to make fear my servant rather than my master. Marie said that the true art of killing was not in the hand but in the mind. "You must look at a man and see the shape of his ending," she told me, "and then make it beautiful." When I wasn't with her, I watched the men who passed me in the markets, the merchants with their gold watches, the planters with their fat fingers, the ones who smiled too long at the women they owned. I imagined what their last moments would look like. I didn't feel guilt. I felt preparation. One evening, Marie placed a small velvet pouch in my palm. Inside was a vial of pale liquid and a sprig of dried herbs. "A gift," she said. "It's time you start practicing alone." "What is it?" "Knowledge," she said. "Distilled." I held the vial up to the candlelight. The liquid shimmered faintly like mercury. I felt its power hum against my skin. "How do I use it?" "Wisely," she said, "or not at all." That night, as I walked home through the humid streets, I thought about what she meant. The truth was, I had no intention of using it yet, not until I found the right man, the one who deserved it. But deep down, I knew something had changed. Killing Pierre had been survival. What came next would be something else entirely. It would be deliberate, strategic, necessary. The city buzzed around me with life, but I felt something colder awakening inside. I was no longer prey. I was learning to become a predator with patience, a woman who understood the delicate balance between mercy and revenge. Marie once said that poison was a form of prayer, quiet, invisible, and final. If that was true, then I was already halfway to sainthood. Freedom did not quiet me, it sharpened me. I thought liberty would bring peace, but instead it brought possibility, dangerous, glittering possibility. Every morning when I opened my eyes in my little house on Rue Ursulines, I felt the same thought rise like steam. What can I make of this day that no one ever allowed me to claim before? The first weeks after Pierre's death, I walked through the markets as a different creature. I was no longer property. I was rumor, the beautiful freedwoman whose master had died suddenly and left her a fortune. Men looked at me with curiosity, women with suspicion, preachers with disapproval. None of them knew the truth that I had killed him, and that the act had given me the calmest sleep of my life. With $5,000 and my papers of manumission, I purchased a modest home, plain on the outside but bright inside, with lace curtains and furniture I chose for myself. I felt like a newborn woman building her own name from the dust. Yet freedom in New Orleans came with conditions. A free woman of color could walk through the quarter in silk, but she could never walk beyond its borders without being reminded who still ruled the streets. I invested Pierre's money carefully. I bought a small property I could rent to travelers. I learned to read account ledgers from a free man named Julian, who kept books for the docks. He taught me about interest and credit, and I discovered that numbers could be weapons more subtle than knives. But knowledge alone could not protect a woman from loneliness or from hunger for control. It was during this time that I met Jean-Baptiste Laurent, a merchant of imported goods whose perfume announced him before his voice. He was 48, elegant, self-assured, and utterly certain that charm was the same thing as goodness. When he called on me for the first time, I recognized the game before he did. "You live alone, Madame Dubois?" he asked, his gaze sliding over the polished parlor I had built with my own money. "I live as I please," I said. He laughed, that practiced masculine laugh that pretends to admire independence while already plotting how to contain it. Within weeks he brought flowers, then jewelry, then talk of marriage. He saw my beauty as his future investment, my wealth as the foundation for his next venture. I let him believe it. I learned to nod at the right places, to hide my mind behind my smile. Every word he spoke was a page in a book I had already read. We married quietly in the summer of 1836, a civil ceremony witnessed by two clerks who barely looked up from their papers. I wore grey silk, the color of storms. At first, Jean-Baptiste behaved as though he had rescued me from myself. He strutted through the house, issuing improvements, new curtains, new servants, new debts. "A woman shouldn't trouble herself with accounts," he said one evening as he took the ledger from my hands. "Numbers are for men." I smiled. "Of course, monsieur. Tell me, then what shall I do with all this free time?" "Be beautiful," he said. "That is profit enough. He began hosting dinner parties that glittered with candlelight and deception. The guests admired our furnishings, while Jean-Baptiste spoke loudly of his ventures in Havana and Marseille. Each toast drained a little more of my patience. I could almost feel Marie Laveau's voice at my ear. Men like this think they are too clever to die. I started small, a grain of arsenic hidden in the coffee, another in the wine. A week later, another. Poison, Marie had said, is a conversation between patience and precision. Jean-Baptiste's health began to fail by midsummer. He complained of stomach cramps, headaches, and exhaustion. It must be the climate, the doctor said. I agreed, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. For 3 months I played nurse, wife, saint. Each day I stirred a little more truth into his meals. Each night I practiced the expression of grief I would need when the time came. By September 1839 he was too weak to stand. The final dose dissolved in a cup of sweet wine. He thanked me for caring for him. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Always." When he died, the doctor called it swamp fever. The neighbors called it tragic. The notary called it profitable. I inherited his business shares, his property, and $12,000. I did not cry at the funeral, but I made sure everyone believed I did. That night I went to Marie. She listened as I recounted each step. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You've learned the art," she said, "but art without purpose turns to rot. What will you do with this money, Delilah?" "I'll invest," I said, "in freedom for others." She smiled, and for the first time I saw something like respect in her eyes. "Then you may yet balance the scales. With Jean-Baptiste's fortune, I bought 2 more houses and a small share in a sugar warehouse. Through Marie's network, I quietly began purchasing freedom papers for enslaved families. Each transaction was written under another name, hidden behind legal smoke. I told myself that every man who died by my hand would fund the release of others. It did not make me good, but it made me necessary. In 1840, at a charity gathering, I met Armand Rousseau. He was 60, a widower with trembling hands and the polite weariness of a man who had lived too long surrounded by greed. He spoke softly, quoted scripture, and looked at me with the reverence of one who mistook cunning for virtue. I decided almost immediately that he would be my next husband. Armand proposed in October. The wedding at St. Louis Cathedral was grander than I preferred, but appearances were important now. My reputation as the fortunate widow had to be preserved. Unlike Pierre and Jean-Baptiste, Armand was kind. He thanked the servants, sent money to the church, and called me ma chère in a voice that almost made me pity him. But pity is a dangerous luxury. He had built his fortune on the backs of sugar slaves whose names he never knew. His kindness did not absolve him. Armand suffered from diabetes, a disease few understood and none could cure. His doctor, Monsieur Mercier, visited weekly. Leaving bottles of medicine I pretended to administer faithfully. In truth, I replaced the contents drop by drop. I sweetened his tea more each day, adjusted his meals until the very food that comforted him became his undoing. It took 2 years, a slow, graceful descent. He wasted away surrounded by admiration for his devoted wife. When he finally died in 1842, the priest called him blessed. I called him balanced. From his estate I inherited $25,000, a plantation house, and investments in sugar and cotton. Combined with what I already owned, my fortune neared $50,000, but the wealth was less important than what it represented. Proof that my success with Pierre and Jean-Baptiste had not been luck. It was skill, discipline, vision. Marie visited me one evening after the funeral. We sat on the veranda as the sunset bled across the Mississippi. 3 men, she said quietly. How many will it take before you stop? When the ledger is even, I said. And how will you know when that is? When the system that made me ceases to exist. She sighed, old eyes seeing further than mine. Then you will never stop. Perhaps she was right. Yet the world already whispered my new legend. The widow who loved too fiercely and lost too often. They pitied me, envied me, admired my resilience. No one suspected the truth hiding behind the lace veils and soft smiles. At night I would count the deeds and papers locked in my desk, the homes, the bonds, the names of those Marie had freed with the money I sent. Each document was a life traded for another. 7 deaths for 100 freedoms, that was the arithmetic I had begun to practice. 3 men were gone. The city called it tragedy. I called it balance beginning. By the time the year 1843 turned its back on New Orleans, my name had become a quiet superstition. Women whispered it behind fans at the opera. Men said it with a smirk and a trace of unease. Madame Dubois, they called me, or the fortunate widow. My 3 husbands had died in comfort. each leaving me richer, and yet society pitied me as if I carried a curse. I smiled at their pity. A curse can be a shield when wielded by the right hands. Money moved around me like water now. I owned 3 houses, 2 along Royal Street and 1 in the Marigny district, all rented to merchants or sailors who cared little for their landlady's reputation. The profits kept my ledgers fat, and my donations to Marie's Quiet Freedom Network flowed beneath the surface like an underground river. For every husband who had died in his bed, another man, woman, or child stepped into freedom. That arithmetic soothed me when the nights grew long, but comfort breeds complacency, and complacency invites hunger. I had proved that I could survive. Now I wanted to rule my own legend. My 4th husband, Claude Fontaine, arrived by way of Havana, a trader with silver teeth and a laugh that never quite reached his eyes. He spoke of opportunity, of expansion, of turning sugar into gold. I met him at a gathering for Creole merchants, his hand heavy with rings, his accent sharp as broken glass. He called me Madame Fortune the first night we danced, and I decided that he would become proof that my fortune was not chance. Claude was different from the others, clever, restless, cruel in subtle ways. He enjoyed seeing people squirm. Servants trembled when he entered a room, not because he struck them, but because he liked to hover too close, to make them guess what he might do. He saw the world as a chessboard, and every piece was for sale, including me. Our marriage was a spectacle: fine wines, silk gowns, a carriage with my initials painted in gold. New Orleans gossiped for weeks. How lucky she is, they sighed. May the poor woman find peace this time. Peace was never my intention. Claude's empire was built on deceit. He smuggled rum under false labels and bribed customs officers with gifts wrapped in politeness. I learned his trade as I had learned every man's habits before him, by listening more than I spoke. In time, I discovered ledgers he kept hidden behind a false panel in his study. They told a story of debts, betrayals, and enemies waiting for his downfall. I realized I did not need to destroy him. The city was already doing it for me. All I had to do was guide the ending. Marie's earlier lesson whispered in my mind, never use the same method twice. So I abandoned arsenic and sweetness for something new: veratrum viride, a green extract used by certain midwives to induce sickness. In small doses, it slowed the pulse, drained the color from the skin, mimicked the heart's betrayal. I began in spring. Each evening I mixed a few drops into his wine, pretending to toast his success. By midsummer, his complexion had turned waxy, his breath shallow. He blamed the heat, the humidity, the stress of business. The doctor prescribed rest. I prescribed patience. He died on a Sunday morning while writing letters he never finished. His hand froze mid-word. When the pen rolled from his fingers, I caught it before it stained the floor. Heart failure, the doctor said again, as though it were a spell cast to explain the inexplicable. I inherited his ships, his warehouses, and his debts, which I quickly erased by selling his assets to his enemies. New Orleans marveled at my resilience. Poor Madame Fontaine, they murmured. How much can one woman endure? I endured, yes, and I thrived. Husband number 5, Henry Beaumont, came only a year later. He was young, too young, barely 30, with smooth skin and ambition sharp enough to cut glass. He fancied himself a reformer, a man of reason who believed slavery would end not through mercy but through economics. He wanted to build a factory, to replace flesh with machinery, to modernize the South. His arrogance wore the costume of progress. Henry courted me not for love but for the illusion of partnership. Together we could change everything, he said, mistaking my silence for devotion. He believed himself enlightened because he wanted to abolish chains while keeping control of those who wore them. I smiled and let him dream. Unlike Claude, Henri was careful with his food, suspicious by nature. So I turned to something slower, psychological rather than chemical. I fed his ego, not his body. I whispered that his friends doubted him, that investors mocked his youth, that perhaps I alone truly believed in his vision. The more he obsessed over his imagined enemies, the less he slept, the more brandy he drank. I placed no poison in his cup. He did that himself. Within 2 years he was bankrupt, paranoid, and shaking from the inside out. One morning he shot himself in his study, leaving behind a note that blamed everyone but me. I tore it in half and burned it before anyone could read. Society clucked its tongue. How tragic, they said. Another husband lost. But whispers began to darken beneath the sympathy. 6 years, 5 deaths. A coincidence stretched thin as lace. To quiet the rumors, I married again my 6th and perhaps most calculated choice, Louis Morand, a widowed banker in his 50s, respectable, devout, eager to restore my good name. He was gentle in speech, cautious in habit, and trusted the church more than medicine. I chose him precisely because of that. He represented safety, and safety was the best disguise for danger. Louis doted on me as though I were a fragile saint. He prayed at dawn, read scripture aloud at dinner, and praised God for sending me to heal his lonely heart. I let him. Faith made him predictable. He refused wine, avoided indulgence, and believed every misfortune could be cured by prayer. I could not use poison on such a man, it would have been too obvious. Instead, I used his faith against him. He suffered from a persistent cough. The doctor suggested a tonic of opium and syrup. I prepared it myself each evening, carefully increasing the dosage until his prayers slurred into nonsense and his pulse slowed to a whisper. On the final night, he reached for my hand and said, "You are an angel, Delilah." "I am exactly what God made me," I answered. When he died, the priest declared it the will of heaven. The city wept for him. They buried him with hymns and incense, and I stood at the grave with a veil over my face, hiding the calm in my eyes. By 1851, my wealth had crossed $100,000. I owned property from Street Charles Avenue to the river docks. More than 50 enslaved souls had walked free because of the funds Marie and I funneled through false estates. Yet freedom did not erase fear. The gossip that once pitied me now hinted at witchcraft, at curses, at a black widow whose lovers met untimely ends. I made sure the whispers stayed useful. I donated to churches, hosted charity galas, dressed modestly in black as if mourning perpetually. Men still courted me, drawn by morbid fascination. They wanted to possess the woman who survived 6 husbands, as if to prove they could. They called me lucky, but I knew luck had nothing to do with it. It was calculation, patience, and a devotion to justice that no law recognized. When I walked through the quarter, people stepped aside. Respect, fear it no longer mattered which one drove them. Power is power, no matter the name it wears. And yet, as the years settled on my shoulders like fine dust, I began to sense the circle tightening. Every legend draws hunters. Every secret leaves a trail. I wondered how many more men I would bury before fate came to collect its debt. I did not have to wait long to find out. For in the winter of 1852, I met the man who would finally turn my legend into a trap, Antoine Chevalier VII, the last, the one who saw too clearly. I met Antoine Chevalier on an evening that smelled of rain and secrets. The city had just begun to cool after a brutal summer, and the air felt like it was holding its breath. I was attending a masquerade at the home of a French consul, one of those gatherings where New Orleans pretends to be Paris for a night. Gold masks, violins, laughter that hides cruelty. I wore black silk, my face veiled with lace. When I stepped into the candlelight, the conversations paused just long enough for me to feel their judgment. "There she is," they whispered. "The woman whose husbands die too easily. The woman misfortune adores." Antoine was standing near the balcony, half in shadow, watching me the way a mathematician studies a problem he intends to solve. He was older than Henri, younger than Louis, and unlike any of the men before him. His hair was touched with grey, his suit immaculate, his posture upright but unpretentious. When he finally approached, he did not bow or flatter. "Madame Dubois," he said softly, "I wonder if the stories about you are more fascinating than the truth." I smiled beneath my mask. "That depends which stories you've heard." "That you are the most unfortunate woman in New Orleans," he said, "and the luckiest. That sounds like contradiction." He tilted his head. "No, that sounds like design." That was how it began, an encounter made of words, sharpened like blades. He spoke with the precision of a man accustomed to analysis, a cotton broker whose life revolved around patterns, shipments, ledgers, human behavior. Where others saw chance, Antoine saw sequence. Where others called me cursed, he called me calculated. For weeks afterward, he sent letters, never love letters, always questions. He asked about my late husbands, my views on commerce, my knowledge of law. He visited without invitation, yet left before impropriety could be whispered. He fascinated me because he was not ruled by desire but by curiosity. He wanted not my beauty but my mystery. I told myself that marrying him would be my greatest test. To charm a man who already suspected the truth would prove my mastery. To control the mind of one who studied control itself, that would be art. We married in the spring of 1852. The ceremony was small, proper, almost antiseptic. Antoine wore black, I wore ivory. When the priest pronounced us husband and wife, his hand tightened around mine not with affection, but with acknowledgement, as if sealing a contract between predator and prey, though neither of us yet knew which was which. From the start, he made it clear that he intended to understand me. "You fascinate me, Delilah," he said one evening while I poured his wine. "Many around you, and yet you live untouched. Do you ever wonder why fate spares you?" I met his gaze calmly. "Perhaps fate owes me a debt." He smiled. "Or perhaps you are collecting one." Antoine was meticulous to the point of obsession. He balanced his own accounts, prepared his own meals, and locked his study each night with a key he wore around his neck. He trusted no one fully, and that included me. Every precaution he took was a confession that he believed the whispers. At first, I played the devoted wife. I managed the household, entertained his partners, and read to him by lamplight when his eyes tired. But behind every gesture of tenderness, I studied him. He was a man of routines: coffee at dawn, a walk by the river, business until noon, a ledger balanced before bed. Yet beneath that order lay a restlessness I recognized. Antoine feared death not for its pain, but for its unpredictability. He believed logic could conquer even mortality, and so I began my final experiment. Poison was no longer enough. It had become too easy, too predictable. Antoine's suspicion required something subtler, something that would appear as nature itself reclaiming what logic denied. Marie Laveau had once shown me a venom distilled from the glands of a coral snake, a substance so delicate it mimicked the paralysis of a stroke. "It is mercy disguised as thunder," she had said. I had kept a small vial of it for years, waiting for the man who deserved its elegance. Antoine was that man. It took months of patience. I slipped minute amounts into his coffee on mornings when he was distracted. His body began to betray him slowly, tremors in the hands, slurred words, fainting spells dismissed as exhaustion. He called the doctor himself, of course. The diagnosis was overwork. I pretended to worry, my hand resting gently on his. "You must rest, my love," I told him. "Let me take care of you." He studied me with those grey eyes that missed nothing. "You are very attentive, Delilah," he said, almost anticipatory. Inside, my pulse quickened. "Is it wrong for a wife to care for her husband?" "No," he said softly, "but sometimes care hides curiosity." The venom continued its quiet work. His speech slowed, his left side weakened. The doctor prescribed tonics and prayers. I played the grieving nurse flawlessly. At night I sat beside his bed, reading aloud from his favorite books, my voice smooth and calm even as his hand began to twitch like a dying bird's. Then, one morning in late autumn, he collapsed in his office. The servants found him gasping, his eyes unfocused. I ran to him, calling his name with perfect panic. He died before the priest could arrive. The doctor declared it a stroke inevitable for a man of his age and constitution. The funeral was grand, attended by half the city. They whispered that perhaps my curse had struck again. I wept behind a veil, but my tears were real this time, not for him, but for the weariness that had begun to creep into my bones. I thought it was over. I thought I had perfected the art so completely that even suspicion would bow before my performance. But Antoine was a man of preparation. 2 weeks after the burial, a messenger arrived carrying a sealed letter addressed to the chief magistrate. It was from Antoine himself, written months earlier. Inside was a record of his suspicions, a list of the deaths surrounding me, and a simple instruction: if I die suddenly, investigate my wife. Within days, whispers turned into accusations. Detectives came to my door with polite smiles and sharp questions. They searched the house, examined the pantry, questioned the servants. They found nothing but absence can speak louder than presence. Coincidences, the inspector said, but too many to ignore. I remained calm. I invited them to tea. I let them see the trembling of my hands, the soft quiver of my voice. "Do you truly believe," I asked, "that a woman could do all these things alone?" He hesitated. "We believe, madame, that a woman who has buried 6 husbands might understand death better than most." That night I sat by the fire, staring at the empty chair where Antoine had once read his papers. His shadow seemed to linger in the room, smug and satisfied. He had played his move even from the grave. I realized with a kind of bitter admiration that I had finally met an equal. I did not fear arrest, not yet, but I felt the circle tightening. Antoine had been right about one thing: design, not luck, governs fate. And the pattern I had drawn through years of patience was finally closing on itself. Still, I did not regret him. Each husband had taught me something about greed, arrogance, cruelty, and now intelligence. Antoine's death was not vengeance. It was inevitability. As I prepared to face whatever storm his letter had summoned, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I barely recognized the woman staring back. My eyes held no warmth, my smile no sweetness. I was not the frightened girl sold on Chartres Street. I was the author of my own legend, and perhaps its final chapter was already being written. The morning they led me through the streets in irons, the air smelled of magnolia and rot sweetness fighting decay. Crowds had gathered along Royal Street, not to mourn but to watch. Some crossed themselves as I passed, as if my shadow could infect them. Others smiled, eager to witness the downfall of a woman who had dared to live by her own design. I walked upright, the clink of chains marking my rhythm, my eyes fixed ahead. Fear had long ago lost its hold on me. What remained was curiosity how history would choose to remember me. Detective Marcel Roussel walked beside me, his face expressionless, his tone polite to the point of cruelty. "You may still save yourself, Madame Chevalier," he said softly. "If you confess and repent, the court might show mercy." "Mercy?" I asked. "From men who never showed any to me?" He said nothing more. The wheels of justice were already turning, and I was their chosen offering. At the courthouse, the noise struck like a wave, reporters scribbling, women whispering behind lace veils, men clutching newspapers that screamed, "The poisoned husbands of New Orleans, the Black Widow unmasked. Slave turned murderess faces gallows." The city had turned my life into theater, and I was the final act. Inside, I sat between two guards at a table polished to a mirror sheen. My lawyer, Maître Beauregard, leaned toward me. His perfume smelled faintly of gin and desperation. "You must appear sympathetic," he whispered. "A victim of circumstance, not will. Let me do the talking." "Do they ever let women talk?" I murmured. He sighed. "Only when it's too late." The judge entered, robes sweeping the floor, his expression carved from granite. The jury, 12 white men of property, regarded me as one might a curiosity in a cage. Their eyes slid over my skin, my hair, the curve of my shoulders, measuring not my guilt but the scandal of my existence. The prosecutor, Charles Gouillard, began his tale like a sermon. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said, "this woman has buried 7 men, each richer than the last, each dying under mysterious circumstances. Coincidence or calculation?" His words rose and fell like waves, washing away nuance. He painted me as a witch, a seductress, a venomous creature who turned love into a weapon. "She used beauty where men use strength," he declared. "She turned marriage, a holy institution, into a marketplace of murder." The crowd gasped on cue. When it was Beauregard's turn, he spoke calmly, rationally, as though logic could save me. "Gentlemen, the prosecution offers suspicion, not proof. My client's misfortune is tragic, not criminal. Arsenic in the soil? Common in New Orleans. Weak hearts, bad. Diets, yellow fever, all possible. Will you condemn a woman because the world around her is unkind?" The jurors' faces betrayed nothing. They had already chosen the story they preferred. Day after day, witnesses paraded through the courtroom, doctors, servants, acquaintances. Dr. Mercier described how he had treated Armand Rousseau. "He grew weaker each month," the doctor said, "but such decline is common in men with his condition. I never suspected foul play." The prosecutor smiled. "And yet, doctor, would you agree that certain poisons can mimic illness?" "In theory, yes," he admitted. Next came a chemist, who spoke of arsenic found in the exhumed remains of Jean-Baptiste Laurent and oleander compounds in Pierre Dubois. The jury leaned forward, fascinated by the science they barely understood. Then came the servants' voices trembling under oath. "Madame always insisted on preparing Monsieur's tea herself," one said. "She never let anyone else near his cup." "And did she seem distraught when he died?" "She was calm, sir. Too calm," some said. Each testimony was a thread. By the time the prosecutor finished, he had woven a noose of narrative so tight it scarcely mattered that none of it proved anything beyond coincidence. When all arguments had been made, the judge asked if I wished to speak. Beauregard shook his head sharply. "Do not," he whispered. "Let them see silence as dignity." But silence was the one thing I had endured all my life. I rose. The courtroom stilled. "Your Honor," I said, "I have been silent for too many years. If I am to die, I will not do it voiceless." The judge hesitated. "You understand that anything you say can only confirm what they already believe," I finished. "Yes, I understand." I turned to face the jury. 12 faces, each carved from judgment, yet curious despite themselves. You sit there deciding what kind of monster I am. I began. You know how many men I married. You know how many died. You do not know why. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I let it settle before continuing. The first man bought me like a horse. The second treated me as his purse. The third called me salvation while counting his profits from sugar and slaves. Every one of them believed beauty meant obedience. I learned their language, their habits, their greed, and I used it against them. The prosecutor rose, shouting, "This is not testimony, it's performance." "It's truth," I said, my voice cutting through his. "For 20 years, men like these called me property. I became a mirror, showing them what their power looked like when turned upon itself. I reached into the folds of my dress and withdrew my small leather journal. The guards stiffened, expecting a weapon. In a sense, it was. "This contains the names of 125 souls," I said. "People whose freedom was bought with the money those men left behind. I gave my blood money to Marie Laveau, who used it to purchase theirs. 7 men died, 125 lived. If that is evil, then perhaps evil can do good." The courtroom erupted, half in outrage, half in disbelief. The judge pounded his gavel until the sound became thunder. "Order!" he roared. "Order, or I will clear the room." When silence finally fell, I said quietly, "I did what I had to. I refused to remain what this world made me. If you want to call me murderer, do. But understand this, I learned from your own laws. I took the logic of ownership and used it to buy freedom." Beauregard buried his face in his hands. The prosecutor stared at me as if I were blasphemy made flesh. The jurors' expressions hardened, not from doubt, but from fear that the monster before them made too much sense. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts, death by hanging. The judge spoke as though reading scripture. "You are articulate, Madame Chevalier, intelligent, and utterly lost. The court cannot forgive what the soul of man cannot comprehend. May God show mercy where we cannot." I bowed my head slightly. God and I have never been properly introduced. The gavel fell. As guards led me from the courtroom, I glanced once more toward the gallery. Among the spectators, I saw familiar faces, men and women whose freedom I had purchased with the fortunes of the dead. Their eyes met mine, filled not with pity but with understanding. In that moment, I felt something close to peace. Outside, the sky had darkened. Rain began to fall, washing dust from the courthouse steps. I lifted my hands, still bound, and let the drops touch my skin. Each one felt like absolution. The cell they gave me was smaller than any coffin, and yet I found more peace inside its walls than I had in most mansions. The air was heavy with lime and damp stone. Through the single-barred window I could see a sliver of the Mississippi, gray and wide, carrying everything away, sins, secrets, and the ash of history. The river never asked forgiveness, it simply kept moving. I envied it. The guards spoke little. Perhaps they feared me. Perhaps they feared the stories whispered by washerwomen and merchants that my eyes could curse a man, that I had made a pact with spirits darker than night. Let them think so. Fear was my final armor. On the first night the chaplain came. He was a small, soft-spoken man who looked as though compassion had worn him thin. He carried a Bible bound in cracked leather. "God can still forgive you, child," he said gently. "I've spent a lifetime paying debts that weren't mine," I answered. "If God wants to balance the books, he knows where to find me." He prayed anyway. His voice echoed down the corridor like wind through a crypt. When he finished, I thanked him, and he left with eyes full of pity. I preferred pity to disgust. It was quieter. Days blurred into one another. The food tasted of metal. The candle by my bed burned low each night, leaving soot in the corners. I counted time by sound, the footsteps of the warden, the click of the guard's key, the tolling of the cathedral bells that measured out the city's life beyond my reach. Each ring reminded me that I was already halfway between the world of the living and the one beyond it. Marie Laveau visited me once. She came not as the queen of whispers, but as a woman, veiled and silent. The guards allowed her in reluctantly. Even they feared her. She sat beside me, her perfume cutting through the stench of the cell. "You've caused quite the storm, Delilah," she said. "I've lived my whole life inside storms," I replied. "This one simply has better witnesses." Her laugh was low and sad. "You've frightened them, you know. The men who run this city. You've turned their power into reflection, and they can't stand the sight." "I didn't mean to frighten them," I said. "Only to remind them that cages have keys, and sometimes the bird learns to use them." She nodded, reaching into her shawl. "I brought you something." She placed a small pouch in my hand, grains of salt and a sprig of rosemary. "For cleansing," she said. "For memory." I thought memory was its own curse. "Only when it belongs to the wrong people," she said. We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she stood. "They will make an example of you," she said quietly. "But examples have a way of becoming legends. Choose what kind you'll be." After she left, I held the pouch and thought of every face I had freed through my crimes. I whispered their names until dawn, one by one, like beads on a rosary. It was my own kind of prayer. The morning of my execution came with an unexpected calm. The warden opened the door and said my name as though announcing a guest. My chains had been polished. My dress was plain white cotton, starched stiff. They bound my wrists, but the gesture felt ceremonial, not cruel. Outside, the courtyard swelled with people. Some prayed aloud, some jeered, some craned for a better view. Reporters dipped their pens in ink, ready to immortalize the spectacle. I wondered which details they would invent. The gallows stood against the grey sky, a scaffold of wood that creaked like an old ship. I climbed each step slowly, listening to the boards complain beneath my feet. At the top, the hangman waited broad-shouldered, eyes downcast. The rope swayed gently in the breeze, already looped, already hungry. The chaplain stood nearby, Bible in hand. "Confess, Delilah," he whispered. "Clean your soul before you meet the Lord." "My soul is clean enough," I said. "It's the world that's dirty." He crossed himself and stepped back. When the hangman approached, he hesitated. "Any last words?" I looked out over the crowd. Thousands of eyes, each certain they understood what justice meant. I thought of Pierre's whip, Jean-Baptiste's laughter, Armand's piety, Claude's arrogance, Henri's reformer's pride, Louis's prayers, Antoine's logic. 7 men who had shaped my story and 7 graves that had built my legend. "My last words," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected, "are for those who still wear chains. You think freedom is something you're given, but it isn't. It's something you take and something you pay for. I've paid. Now it's your turn." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some cursed, some wept. The hangman pulled the hood over my head. Darkness came like an old friend. In that darkness, I thought of the river, of Marie's eyes, of every child who had walked free because of the men I'd buried. I did not pray. I simply breathed once, deeply, tasting the air of the world one last time. Then the floor gave way. It was quick, merciful, almost. My body swung, but my mind was already elsewhere, floating above the courtyard, watching the crowd scatter like ants after rain. The rope creaked, and the legend began to settle into the city's bones. They buried me in Street Louis Cemetery No. 1, in a grave marked only by my initials. But stories travel faster than decay. Within months, women left flowers at my tomb. Some called me sinner, some saint, some both. They said if you touched the stone and whispered the name of a man who wronged you, justice would follow. The priests tried to stop them. They failed. Marie tended the grave for years, until she too vanished into myth. She told people that my spirit did not rest, that I wandered the quarter at night, walking past the houses I once owned, listening for the sound of shackles breaking in the dark. I like to believe that part is true. Years later, newspapers printed my story again, dressing it up for their times. The beautiful widow of New Orleans, the poison queen, the slave who seduced death itself. They never got my voice right. They made me villain or victim, but never author. Yet stories have their own kind of immortality. Every retelling keeps me alive, and perhaps that is fitting. I never wanted heaven. I wanted memory. If you walk through the quarter today, you might still feel me there in the whisper of silk on cobblestone, in the faint perfume of oleander after rain. When the church bells toll, count them. 7. For 7 husbands. For 7 fortunes. For 7 deaths that built one kind of freedom and bought another. I am Delilah Dubois Chevalier. I was born in bondage, lived by my wits, killed by my design, and died by the world's need to name its monsters. But history, if it's honest, will remember me not as monster nor martyr, but as mirror. Because everything I did, I learned from those who claimed to own me. I simply returned the lesson. The river still flows past New Orleans, indifferent and endless. Someday, it will swallow the cemeteries, the houses, even the gallows. But until that day, I remain in the current part vengeance, part salvation, all woman. And if you listen closely to the water's murmur, you might hear my voice between the ripples. Freedom is never given. It is taken. And sometimes it is bought with blood.